listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and suddenly everybody left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of personal stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with professionals in the grief world. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Jana DeCristofaro, and produced by Dougie Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. On the day I'm recording this, it's still June, which means it's still Pride Month. And this year, 2023, Pride is happening in the context of hundreds of anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ bills being put forth in legislative arenas. This context makes today's conversation with Jamie Thrower, founder of the Queer Grief Club, feel even more vital. Jamie is a queer death doula, end-of-life educator, and grief guide here in Portland, Oregon. Jamie is dedicated to creating queer-specific spaces for end-of-life care and grief support. Jamie also knows from her personal experience of grieving the deaths of both of her parents and then her daughter, Birdie, who she and her wife lost in the second trimester, just how important it is for grief support offerings to reflect your identity, your relationships, your family constellations, and your community. Without this, grief support can be, as Jamie writes, disheartening at best, but more often than not, it is a harmful and painful reminder of our continued erasure and discrimination because of our LGBTQ+ identities. While Jamie and I started out with the plan to talk about the work she's doing to create these affirming grief support offerings, we eventually got there, but we also took a side trip down the rabbit hole of why grocery shopping can be so dang terrible when you're grieving, and how, in an ideal world, there would be a specific checkout line for people who don't want to or don't know how to answer the casual, "Hey, how's your day going?" question without going into their entire grief story. Jamie is kind and funny and super committed to changing the landscape of traditional grief support. Through the Queer Grief Club, she's creating more inclusive spaces for queer and trans people that not only honor those aspects of their identities, but also provide alternative ways to engage with grief beyond just sitting and talking about it. Jamie, welcome to Grief Out Loud. Thank you for making time to be part of the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Which of the losses that you've experienced in your life feel important to kind of bring into the room today together?
Yeah, well, we are coming up on Father's Day, and that's one that's pretty significant in my life. But something that I've been thinking about a lot, there's these concrete losses of my parents and our baby, but the bigger grief experience of my queer community is something that I'm like really feeling deeply right now. To kind of watch the world continue to turn its back on our community it's disheartening at best, and really harmful at its worst. And I feel protective of my community. I feel that grief and that sadness. And there's something about that within, especially being Pride Month, a lot of us are really feeling it. So that's something that I've been talking about a lot with people, and just, our losses, our physical, tangible losses are really important, and our death losses are really important. And there's this bigger non-tangible loss and grief and destruction that we're watching every day, and to have to kind of bear witness to that as a community and also find our resiliency in that is a really tough challenge to do day after day.
Yeah, and in thinking about the enormity of that, it's not even it's types of non-death losses that the queer community, your community, my community are experiencing right now, or forecasting to be experiencing, is how I think about it a lot of times too, like what's coming.
Yeah.
Is there a way in which your like lived experience with death loss, of the death of your parents and the death of your baby, plays into the ways that you're able to either conceive of these non-death losses or interact with people around them?
Yeah, I've in my own examining of my losses, especially of my parents, it's been almost 15 years since my dad died and almost 8 since my mom died. Really examining kind of those secondary losses that are a part of that, like all the other losses, and types of grief that are associated with death losses, but you don't necessarily always think about that because and society certainly doesn't think about that either. In my own examination and being able to say, like, there is a part of my grief that's tied to my queerness and not ever being able to come out to my dad. Like, that's an experience that I'll never get to have. Or, in thinking about how difficult it is for me to be a young person really with no parents, but there are so many people within my community that are young people that don't have parents, but their parents are still living. And so, the complexities and kind of continuing to explore and see the kind of expansion that if you really lean into grief and talk about it and start to see all the ways that it's not just fully death related, it's really in response to big change, then it really helps me start to find ways of working with other folks or just in talking to other people and seeing those kind of lines of connection in where all of our grief intersects, or the common threads, and then the things that are different, and kind of being able to make space for all of that, because all of my losses have been so different and have elicited different grief responses too. So, I've gotten to see so many different ways that I've shown up in my grief for myself, that I can kind of see that in other people too.
And in a sense, in a weird, darkly humored sense, you're like the perfect person to be doing the work you're doing, right? Because you're like, I see that, yeah. I see that, I see that. Oh, I see that too, because I have experienced this as well.
Yes. I know it's one of those things where I wish I could sometimes walk around with a list or a resume of all the loss experiences and just say, this is why I'm like this. For better, for worse, really.
With talking about the losses that your community is experiencing, the queer community is experiencing, kind of being the most present right now, or feeling like the most important to talk about, what, I don't know the right word for this, but like, what's the general tone of the conversations that you're having? Because I think about grief having so many different emotions, right? There can be sadness, regret, despair, anger, rage, disappointment. Like, what's the kind of temperature gauge that you're running into right now?
Honestly, defeated sheer exhaustion, that wanting to try and find hope in this, and also just being so tired of the grief and so tired of seeing the same things kind of continue. And that, that grief experience when you kind of just want to scream at the whole world, like, how can you not, like, how are you ignoring this? Like, how can you not see that I'm hurting right now, or this is devastating to me? It's almost a strange parallel of watching, all these horrible things happen to our community at the same time that, like, it's Pride Month and everyone's supposed to be celebrating us, and it ends up feeling really inauthentic. And so I've just found that, like, yeah, it's almost a defeatist, but just like an exhaustion and kind of like deeper sadness. That's the tone of all of this. But a lot of the times also when I'm like talking within, either my friends or larger communities of people, it feels so much easier to manage when we're with each other and when we're able to like share all of these kind of different feelings that come along with the queer experience, the grief experience, and being able to kind of have that like solidarity and community in that has felt really healing. And so it's kind of that, the strange feeling of that comfort, or it's almost like nice to be in that space and talking about these really hard and painful things, but you come out of it feeling more connected to people, and a little, given a tiny bit more to fill up your tank so you can keep going. So it's really a large spectrum, I guess, of feelings, of course. Yeah, I would say it's like this, it's a deep love, and it's also a deep sadness and deep tiredness.
I'm feeling that tiredness today.
Yeah. Yes, it is no one talks about how exhausting grief is day after day. And we expect all of us to keep going, to get back to work, to be productive. And that's not how grief operates. Like grief is not made for our capitalist society, like in order to like give grief the attention that it needs, you need to go slow, you need to be present, you need to allow yourself days to fall apart and time to just readjust to the world. And we don't give ourselves enough time to even figure out what we are feeling most of the time. And so we're just trying to get from one thing to the next and survive. And then we all struggle in our grief and struggle to identify what we're even feeling, because we're not given the time and the space to just let that kind of unfold.
As you were talking earlier, I kept having this idea or this image come to me of, when someone in our life dies or when there's some other loss that we experience that other people aren't experiencing. It's almost like we hear a sound that no one can hear, or we see a color that no one else can see. And then when we find other people who can hear that same sound or see that same color, it doesn't take the pain of the grief away, but it is so validating to be like, I am not the only one seeing this color and hearing the sound that the whole world appears to not see or hear.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's what's missing so much from grief support and from just the way that we talk about grief, is that by kind of keeping ourselves in this very, this is a individual process, and you should, not grieve in public. And the amount of times that people apologize for crying, like all of these human emotions that we have, and we're all conditioned to deal with them internally, deal with them privately. But, then you end up feeling like you're walking on a different energy plane than everybody else, or you're in a totally different world. And so it feels surreal and strange. And, to be walking around carrying these heavy losses, especially in that brand new loss, and to walk into a grocery store and see people shopping for groceries and being like, they have no idea that my mom just died. And they're going to ask me how I'm doing, and I don't know how to answer. Then I'm going to go cry in my car. And I think I'm the only person in the world who does that, because no one else is saying, like, I do that too. Oh my gosh, why is the grocery store like somehow the worst place in grief? I don't know, because it's like one of the most basic things that everyone has to kind of do. And it's a routine thing, but now your routine has changed. And so you're having to kind of refigure out that new world and that new lens that you're looking through the world in. But finding those people, finding, what I've called like grief buddies, who can really validate and normalize the grief experience, which is generally very confusing and scary and intense and filled with a lot of conflicting feelings, to be able to share that and then have that echoed from someone else of like, yeah, I get that. I've felt that way too. Or like, Yeah, it makes a lot of sense that you would feel that way. And you're not the only person. It's so wonderful because there are these little nuances of grief that you just wouldn't get until you get it, you know?
Now you've got me thinking about the grocery store and why is it such a this full of grief potholes? And I'm thinking about there's different things that we do throughout our day, but food is one of the few things that you're almost guaranteed to have some type of memory associated with a person in your life who has died. Not everybody, but almost everybody has had some kind of food memory. Also, it's is it the grocery store or is it the frequency with which we have to go to the grocery store? Because you might think if I had to go to, I don't know, the kayak rental store twice a week, I might think kayak rental stores really spark my grief a lot because I'm not going there twice a week usually, but I'm going to that grocery store 2, 3, sometimes if it's me 6 times a week. And I'm just there a lot. And you're interacting with people in a weird way. You got to navigate space and there's people in your space. And I got a lot more to think about around the grocery store and grief.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a real thing. And when someone unlocks that in another person, it's really, I think it's really sweet to see how many people are like, yeah, I hate the grocery store sometimes and I used to love it. Or now when I go, I feel like I just have to really put on such a, turn my grief off in so many ways in order to interact with all these other humans whose worlds are just spinning on and mine has completely stopped. And when I leave this store, I go home and look at my altar with all the people that I've lost or am grappling with, and no one knows that, by just these very normal exchanges of oh, how's your day going? Oh, this is a cool tomato, as you're going out of the grocery store, checking out. It's such a strange experience having to participate in the world in which your person doesn't exist anymore repeatedly, kind of over and over again, is a startling reality and really difficult for so many people. But if no one talks about that, then everyone just ends up feeling alone and ashamed when they're also crying in their car in the parking lot of New Seasons.
Yeah.
So
I'm now imagining we need to start some sort of trend where there's most of us, well, not all of us, but I know for me, if I'm having a hard day, I love self-checkout, right? Because I don't have to talk to anybody. But if you did have an aisle, like a checkout line that was grief line, where people have been trained in how to talk or not talk or whatever that might be, that you could even put a little button on when you come in the store that says grieving, please don't ask me how I am or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, actually, I did create these little buttons for people that say, please be gentle and kind, grief in process, because when we're faced with the world and the world that wants us to be, polite and kind and happy and not when you're getting that kind of interaction of oh, how's your day going? They're not necessarily, that's a formality and it's a thing that we've just grown accustomed to doing. And so no one's really prepared to see that or hold that real answer. And also people aren't looking for these more subtle cues of, oh, this person looks like they really don't want to engage in a conversation. I'm going to just let them be. Or, you feel like you're walking around with a sign on your forehead, but no one can see it. And that's what's the hardest part about grief is you're just I feel like it's written all over me, but no one else can see that. And so now I really do want to just wear a t-shirt or something that says, please don't talk to me right now. I'm grieving and I just need to get my few things and get out of here. I just think if we were able to really start making more space for people's humanity, we could all really benefit from that. What a concept.
And I'm also realizing we didn't plan to have such a deep conversation about grocery stores and grief, although I think it's very helpful. And so I want to give some space for what we were going to talk about, which is the work that you do in this world, that you bring your lived experience of both of your parents and your baby's death kind of into what you do. Yeah. Do you want to just talk a little bit about kind of like what is the way, like your professional role in this realm?
So I really want to make grief support and the way that we talk about grief and interact with grief a lot more approachable and normalized. And I think something that was striking to me, that's always been striking to me, always, is this notion of having to rejoin the world before you're ready to, and being a grieving person and not really knowing how to find community and wanting to find other people who have shared losses, but not necessarily wanting to exactly go to, a specific grief support group, which like those are really helpful and important and amazing. And also sometimes you're not ready to share, or you just want to engage in or do something and know that your grief is going to be acknowledged, or you are going to go and have this experience and everybody else there is going to know deep loss. So it feels safer, to kind of just be and show up as you are. And so in losing my parents and losing our daughter and all the other miscarriages that we kind of experienced, I really started to see all the ways that also like my queer identity became such a central theme in kind of my grief experience. And so that's kind of where Queer Grief Club started, which was really just me kind of wanting to share my experience and share, other queer people's experience of grief, but then wanting to also like foster a more sense of community. And that's the thing that's been really beautiful to watch, is these friendships and bigger community around wanting to talk about grief or wanting to connect in some way or acknowledge that grief, or even just to go somewhere where that like it's not going to rattle someone's world when they ask you, where do your parents live? Are they still together? And you have to be like, well, they're buried together. And so, yes. And that can like take it. I mean, that literal example happened to me at a dinner party, and it just like shut the whole conversation down, and I immediately felt ashamed and was like, maybe I should have just answered differently and masked in that way. But when I could show up to a place and these people already knew that I had losses of some sort, then I didn't feel as intimidated to be able to talk about them. I love the idea of being able to have these supportive meetups, but that are also, activity based, because oftentimes conversations can feel hard to just do. People have a hard, especially, in the pandemic, we've all been isolated. We're all starting to kind of figure out how to negotiate the world now. And then also just wanting more spaces, more queer spaces to kind of come together and figure out how to support each other, how to rejoin this world, how to still do things that, are tactile and can help us process our grief, or maybe it doesn't, but we get to do something nice and meet some other people who know grief. And I think that that's, to be able to integrate it into life and show people that we can still go and do this movement class, or we can do an art project, or just all kind of hang out together. And the entire experience doesn't have to revolve around our loss, but that there's always space for it. And those genuine conversations and connections inevitably happen because there's no pressure to kind of share. People are just really, they're engaged, they're using their bodies or their minds to kind of think about something differently or to do something creative, and it just unlocks this kind of freedom, I guess, or permission to kind of just share and show up as you are, which is, I think, really, it's really sweet and needed more spaces like that.
So you mentioned movement class and art project. Could you give another example of like a queer grief club offering? And I'm also thinking about like, how do you set it up for folks? Like, is it just totally free form? Is there a little bit of structure? So, I mean, everyone knows they're coming to queer grief clubs, so obviously they know there's grief involved, but just
Yeah,
wondering if
yeah.
there's any like format or structure that you do.
Yeah, it's, it really kind of changes depending on what the offering is. Like I did something that's been really important to me in my grief process that's helped me so much is gardening and having a connection to a garden, creating a memorial garden, creating what I call my grief garden, which is, it being able to kind of dig in the dirt and watch the real life systems and cycle of life continue to humble me. So I a grief garden seed and plant exchange, and that was just kind of an open-ended thing where people could come by anytime if they wanted to kind of share seeds and plants, or if they wanted to receive some from other people. And some people came and just stopped by for, a couple minutes and then moved on. And other people just stayed in the park and hung out and talked and shared, and that was really sweet. And then there are some more structured offerings that are, like we're here to do this art project or to, all do a craft together. We'll just open up that space for if anyone wants to talk about their experience or their grief or, and those kind of little conversations start to happen. So it's a gently organized experiences, because I want people to also really feel like they have power and agency in how they want to show up, and while also protecting the space so that it feels like a cohesive kind of unit. So I like to kind of have experiences that are all kind of over the board, so people can really pick and choose what would feel good to them. It's just like a bigger community conversation online that they can like be a part of, but not have to share anything, but just listen to the experiences of other queer people. That might be really great for someone who's like not necessarily ready to go do a garden volunteer day at a farm or go sit and do an art project for 2 hours. So having that kind of variety is important for me too. So people can really feel like they can engage in their grief in a lot of different ways, and that there's no one right way to do it.
Yeah, like really widening out the accessibility of grief offering, so that it's not just come to like the traditional support groups that we provide at Dougie Center, where it's very like, here's what we do and we're talking now and it's your turn to talk if you want to. This feels, I love the term you used of like gently structured, so that there's places for people to, step into it or be a part of it in a way that feels less formally unveiling, I guess, is the terminology that's coming to me now. And, I feel like we've made a great case for like how important community is when we're grieving, to break down some of that isolation and to increase that sense of validation. What is it about queer specific spaces in grief that is so important?
Oh gosh, yeah. There's so many grief experiences that are unique to the queer community that are generally ignored or not talked about in the kind of bigger grief spaces. And I think that as people who are generally forgotten about or traditionally left out of bigger experiences, that we are always like kind of seeing ourselves being erased in that way. And so when you're going to, I find that grief in the cultural way that we talk about it is very black and white. It's very binary. It's grief is crying and sad and you don't know how to do anything. And then you're happy and you're better and you're over it and you've moved on. And, it's so much, there's so much more to that. And then there's also, there's these hierarchies of relationships and kind of what deserves grief support. So someone who has been with a partner for 15 years but never got married, like, what's the word for that when they lose their partner? Like, if they show up to a widow group, will they be accepted? Will their relationship be accepted? Will they feel safe to share what they're actually feeling? There's so many relationships that are defined or redefined, really, within our community. And so our concept of family and chosen family and the way we express ourselves is so different and doesn't always fit into those kind of traditional grief support models. And I really watched that, and experienced that firsthand of being like, I don't know where to get support right now, because I don't feel like I fit into any of these support groups. When I go into a support group, am I going to be the only queer person there? Am I going to have to explain things about myself or my relationship? Or, I have friends who are like, I don't want to go to a grief group and have to like get misgendered the whole time. Like that doesn't feel supportive. It adds another layer of stress. And so I think, yeah, making room for queer experiences and, not just saying, oh, we welcome everybody, we're inclusive, you're welcome to come. Some people do change their language and that's really helpful. And some people don't, but they're just like, well, yeah, of course you can come to this dad's group for pregnancy loss. And I'm like, okay, but that to me, I'm not a dad. So that's not going to feel super reflective of my experience. And I don't want to have to try and fit into this box of yours. I just want it to be open-ended so that I can feel like my relationship is part of that already, or could be part of that, not just like this, oh, sure, you can like jump in this group, I guess. Yeah. So having queer specific spaces that are for queer people by queer people is, I think, just so important for allowing ourselves to really feel seen and held in that whole, in our whole grief experience, which is really holds so much power in the intersection of, queerness and grief.
Jamie, I hadn't really thought about it until you just were talking about it, where, I sit in this place of running a young adult support group, right, in Portland, Oregon. So we're not a queer specific space, but I would say we have a variety of people coming in the way that I feel like there's not as much explaining that has to happen given the context
Right.
of where we are. And I was also thinking that pregnancy loss, child loss, parenting support group land, I'm like, I can't think of anything more heteronormative, for lack of a better way to describe it, right? Because there's so much of like, parents must mean this and this. And so you talking about like, there's a dad's group and a mom's group, and like, where do I go in that situation? So I wondered if you could share just a little bit more about your experience of trying to access support for the grief after your daughter died.
Yeah, it was such an experience that I kind of didn't think about um the struggle that it would be in my shock and heartache of when we lost our daughter at 17 weeks. And so I just assumed somehow that there would be, queer people have to go through enormous lengths to have babies, or to expand their family in some way. And so I was like, there has to be some support for queer people out there. And then I'm quickly reminded, because even in just the whole fertility world, it's like it feels still like an anomaly that my wife and I were able to kind of go on a fertility journey because everything is so gendered and very specific of like, you need to go through a counseling session before so that you can get approved for IVF. Well, what we know that we have no problem dealing with we know that we have to use a donor. It's fine. Like, and that was really what it was all about. And so, and, having to cross my name off of, father or dad or whatever that was. And so in baby loss, which is like a huge subject of disenfranchised grief, it's a huge thing that people do not want to talk about, do not want to recognize, do not want to even really acknowledge that it's such a significant loss, that it's so heartbreaking, but then especially don't want to acknowledge that it's difficult for the partners too. And so, I feel bad because the pregnancy loss world is so gendered and so heteronormative. And it really shows that there's also no space for men, and there's no space for for dads and for husbands and partners in that way to be to struggle with losing a child in that way. And so my wife could find some of the pregnancy loss and different things, like could find them supportive, even though they were heteronormative in many ways. But, those themes that she could connect to, and a lot of the experiences about it happening to her body. And so, but for me, like if I show up to a pregnancy loss group, they're going to look at me in the way that I present my gender, and they're going to assume that pregnancy loss happened in my body. And if they find out that I didn't, like, am I not supposed to be there because it's not open to quote unquote husbands? Or sometimes there's support groups where it says husbands can join, but like that almost like initiates a hierarchy of grief, of like the grief of the person who is carrying the baby is enormous, and everybody else is kind of secondary to that, when like really, if we just can acknowledge the differences in those griefs, but not making one more significant than the other, and also making space for the fact that fertility is so difficult for queer people. So when we have losses in that way, whether it's miscarriage or pregnancy loss or stillbirth or infertility, there's a different layer to it all. And being able to make space for that, or have that validated, is so incredible. And so I ended up having to find kind of people on my own, other like kind of connecting through really like the internet, of finding somebody else who was a non-gestational parent and lost a baby, and started to kind of find those little people, like you said, like, oh, you can see that color too. Like, yes, you have this experience too. That's so helpful. And also like, it still amazes me that there's not more space for that. But anything that has to do with pregnancy and fertility is so slow to be inclusive of queer people. That is one piece that people really, really struggle with, of making space for queer experiences in that.
I feel like there's so many different directions we could go in this moment, because we've talked about so many different pieces, but I want to just come back to Queer Grief Club, since that's like this offering that you have created in order to alleviate the absences of grief support that are queer specific, where people are not having to take additional steps just to have the people who are in the room with them, whatever that room looks like, understand where they're coming from. So for listeners who are like, oh, I want this in my community, or can I do this? Like, can you just give kind of the logistics of where you're offering these things now and how people can get connected?
Yeah. So I'm generally offering in-person kind of activities and meetups in Portland, Oregon, but looking to kind of expand into some more virtual options so that people from all over could join for either a community conversation or something, that could be done via webinar or Zoom. Because really what this is about for me is that community, and also for people to feel empowered to show up somewhere with their grief and not having to hide it. And so I want people to have access to this kind of support, and I want it to inspire more queer specific grief groups or activity based meetups, or maybe get someone, if this sparks the idea that somebody else could start a queer grief group, great. We need more spaces for that. We need more people who are willing to kind of hold that space. And so, yeah, I encourage people to kind of stay in touch via Instagram. I'm working on a newsletter so I can reach people off of social media, because, social media is a challenging relationship for a lot of us. And yeah, I'm really working on trying to expand my programming in a way that feels really authentic and also involves a lot of other community members. So I was just put a call out the other day for anyone who's wanting to collaborate or to co-facilitate something, and the responses that I got were amazing. And so I'm so excited for all the different ways that other people can kind of contribute to this too, because I don't want to ever feel like an ownership, or, that's the whole point, is that this is community based, that we are all experts in our own grief, and we are all just here to be a community together. And there's not that kind of hierarchy, and this is the expert person and has all the answers, and you guys are all trying to learn. That we all have so much to give each other. And so I'm excited to see where all these collaborations go, and all the different ways we can like incorporate grief into everyday activities or creative activities, or just, communal meals, all kinds of different things. That there's so many ways that this could go. And so I love watching that spark in other people start to go, oh, I wonder if I did a grief thing during this summer camp that I'm going to. Like, when people feel that empowerment to talk about grief, or to or see the response of like, oh, there's a lot of people who are saying, yes, I would love this to be in my city, and like so well received, that I hope that it kind of empowers people to feel like they can do that, and they can incorporate their grief, and they could talk about their grief, and they can open up spaces for grief, and that it's going to be needed, and it's always needed. And people are always grateful for that. Even if it's just one person who shows up, that connection is so important and can make such a difference.
Yeah, I'm really loving this idea of like decentralizing. I don't know why that's the word that's coming to me, with this idea of it kind of like spreading out and people feeling like they have the agency to be like, yeah, I'm doing this, summer camp, and we're going to have arts and crafts, and then we're going to have like photo memorabilia sharing of the people in our lives who have died, or honoring in some way of the grief and the losses we've experienced in this last year. So yeah, I'm feeling inspired too, Jamie. Thank you for sparking that.
I think when people start to realize that, that grief does have a place kind of everywhere, or can have a place everywhere, and that it also doesn't have to take up the whole room, that you can really like integrate grief and then also like go do this other fun thing, and just like making space for so many different life experiences and emotions, instead of just everyone's going to be here and we're all going to be in a good mood because we're at this class together. Yeah, I love the idea of more people figuring out ways to acknowledge their and other people's grief just in regular everyday life.
Yeah, it brings me back to what you'd said earlier of of things in the grief world sometimes feeling so gendered. And I was like, this is an interesting way to like break down the binary that happens even in our individual experiences with grief, where we may have the expectation for ourselves or the expectation is put upon us of here is your 2 weeks, you do all the grief, and then you turn off the switch and you get back to the business of living with brightness and resiliency. And this idea that I mean, you know, and I know, like the only way it works is for it to get completely interwoven and integrated. And that's how we can do that. So I appreciate that you're sort of like doing this on this larger scale. And it's really reflective of the reality of those individual grief experiences. You know, and speaking of your experience with grief, as we come kind of to the end of our conversation, I wanted to come back to that weird question that I was going to ask you. At least I think it's weird because I don't know. I haven't had this conversation with anyone around this question, but just this curiosity of when you think about your grief, whether it's grief of your parents dying or grief of the loss of your daughter or the grief of the general like non-death losses that you are experiencing, what's grief saying to you lately?
Yeah, I love this question because it really encourages you to think about grief as kind of this almost like a little partner beside you who's like giving you messages, no, whether or not you can receive them. And so it really like makes me kind of tap into like, yeah, what is my grief trying to tell me right now? And I really feel like my grief is trying to tell me to slow down, and also that community is really needed, like deeply. And I've really been feeling like I'm an introvert, but I've been feeling the need to just be around people more, to kind of like have that grief witnessed and to witness other people's grief. But also that like slowness, I think when we're kind of going from our day to day moving so fast, when the exhaustion hits, I'm like, oh, I'm so tired. But then when I think about it in terms of my grief, I'm like, my grief is telling me to slow down. And like, what can I do to slow down, to honor my grief, to just slow my thoughts, or kind of notice and appreciate all these little things in my life that kind of turn my brain in a different direction. So like just being able to go and water my plants every day and notice what's changed and what's grown and what's started to die and all the different things, like paying attention to those, slowing down, like that's what starts to make me feel more grounded and able to kind of keep rejoining life in all these different ways, because my grief is always moving and changing and shifting. But yeah, it's also kind of like we need a group hug. We need a big group hug from community. So like keep doing this, like keep having these more like expanding kind of what my little community of just friends and chosen family and family, like how can I kind of expand that and let more people in, and how can I, redefine some of my ideas around what community is and how community interacts and supports with each other. And so it feels like a weird, sweet time with my grief right now, where it's like a little bit tender and also like I feel like it's also telling me that it's proud of me, because like look at where we are, and who would have thought that 15 years after one of the most devastating losses of my life, the first devastating loss, that I would be in the place that I am, and being able to kind of really interact with my grief in this really different way, in this more curious and gentle way than before.
Slowing down and engaging with community. I'm just going to be sitting with that for a bit. So appreciating that so much, Jamie, and really appreciating your time today and for, what you've created in the world with Queer Grief Club, even though I know it's kind of hyper local to Portland right now, but knowing the work you're doing to bring it out to the larger world. So thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for your time today, for having this conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm a huge fan of the Dougie Center, and and just know how important it is, and really grateful to have this. I love talking about grief with other folks. Like, it's these beautiful conversations always unfold. So thanks for having me.
And listeners out there, I will put everything in the show notes about how to connect with Jamie and with the Queer Grief Club on social media, and soon to be in newsletter format if you would like to get off of social media. So that will all be in the show notes. And just a big word of gratitude for all of you for tuning in, for listening to the show, for making it mean something. If you want to reach out to me, you can email me directly at griefoutloud@dougy.org. It's dougy.org. It's also our main website where you'll find information about our local programming, all of our free downloadable resources, and each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Always excited to share, too, that our podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.